and Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, to hopefully help us understand. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your time this afternoon. What is your understanding of what's going on here?
So basically, my understanding of this is that the Competition Commission has dismissed the inclusion of about 23 of the 28 commercial banks because, as you say, lack of jurisdiction and lack of jurisdictional power and reach. The other complication is that many of the banks that are involved, of course, are international banks, so that are not based onshore, they're based offshore. This means that, in fact, a lot of the legislation that South Africa has is not able to legislate in that regard, is not able to have the jurisdiction to then prosecute overseas enterprises. But we do have instruments such as the World Trade Organization and the IMF, which both between them do have jurisdictional power regarding international trade, international finance matters, and it's probably to these that South Africa needs to turn. But it is extremely unfortunate that we have not been able to use some of the fiscal and monetary instruments and tools at our disposal to be able to then, take some sovereignty over our own financial efficacy. It's very regrettable, to say the least.
Which instruments can we then turn to in the country that can deal with this?
So, many countries use, for example, the interest rates, for example, to show that we are able to then ensure that there's a control, the kinds of and the amounts and the velocity of money and cash that is flowing inside the economy. And what this does is that it then controls to some extent the ways in which we spend and the ways in which we're able to then revitalize our economy and particular sectors of the economy. Another thing, of course, is inflation targeting, which I think is very problematic because it makes assumptions about the ways in which we are able to control the flows of the economy. But what inflation often does, it often hampers domestic spending. It often hampers, it often hampers household spending and household expenditure. But what it also does, it also makes it sometimes difficult for businesses to do their business effectively. So inflation means that what you borrow and what you have to return are often very different. So inflation is an instrument that the South African Reserve Bank likes to use. I think that inflation targeting is very problematic, but it is one of the instruments at our disposal. Another one that we can use is taxing particular goods and items. And it's interesting that countries like the United States, for example, have used this because, of course, we know that they practice currency and economic sovereignty to the extent where their sovereignty is sovereign to all other sovereignties, which is extremely problematic and, one could say imperial, for lack of a better term. But what they often do is that they will put in place sanctions to ensure that, for example, countries which have used currency manipulation cannot easily import into the U.S. jurisdiction, for example. And many other countries within Asia have used similar sort of instruments. So I think taxes and tariffs as a way of ensuring that we're able to control what comes in. And lastly, our foreign reserves. So one of the things that's quite interesting is that the extent to which we're able to have foreign exchange reserves in a basket full of currencies then means that we're able to measure the strength of our currency against others. And it also means that we're able to make payments in our own currency versus others. One of the reasons that a lot of developing countries, for example, have suffered from currency depreciation is because of the hegemony of the IMF, the World Bank, for example, and other international instruments which enforce foreign exchange, particularly read that as dollarization of payments, of repayments. What this means in a context where our currency has diminished and depleted the way that South Africa's has over the last 3 years, for example, it means that what we borrowed versus what we then have to pay back is exponentially less. So what we pay back is exponentially more. And the only people who are happy about this sort of currency manipulation are the people who are then exporting, because for them to export, it means that they gain far more than we do in terms of importing. But things like that are some of the instruments that we have at our disposal. And also sovereign wealth funds as a potential way of curbing these sorts of currency excesses as well. And I can say a bit more about that later.
Okay. When we take a look at the language, for instance, of National Treasury, it said at the time that manipulation and rigged traders were isolated and only individual clients were harmed by the activity, not South Africa as a whole. It clarified that the market manipulation in question ended in 2013 and that the rules and regulations had long been put in place to mitigate and avoid this behavior. Thus, the rand collapse and economic stagnation seen over the last 10 years are unrelated, they believe. And so if we have these instruments at our disposal that you have outlined, what then stops us, do you perceive, from using them?
Many things. The one is that, for example, that currency manipulation is not a single player sport. It means you need various other jurisdictions and other economies to be participating. Now, in a context where you have countries which have, over a protracted period of time, countries like Switzerland, countries like Japan, which have practiced currency manipulation over decades, you see that we have quite an issue up against us, because we're not, to the extent to which we're able to control and to curb and to practice currency sovereignty is also linked, unfortunately, to the extent to which we are integrated into global economics and global finances. Secondly, you also have your oil-producing countries and your oil-exporting countries like Saudi Arabia, like Algeria, which is unsurprising, which also, of course, because of the oil to dollar relationship and the fact that many currencies are pegged to the dollar US and oil prices are pegged to the dollar US, have it in their vested interest to also ensure that either the values of those values are quite inflated and so forth, and that they favor themselves at various times. And then lastly, you also have like countries, particular countries in Asia, so-called the new industrialized countries like Taiwan, like Singapore, which also in the past have been found wanting in this regard. And remember, some people will remember, some viewers will remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, that the Asian crash, which was exactly because of this, because of the flow, the unfettered flow of currency between countries and within countries in that regard. China being also a huge player. Now, we also have our geopolitical relationships to manage. And I think that unlike China, who have been able to, for example, make sure that they have one of the largest reserves, if not the largest reserve, of dollars US outside the United States itself. In fact, it's rumored, but of course the information is very opaque, that they actually have greater dollar reserves than the United States themselves, which is, of course, does not make the U.S. very happy. All of this means that it's very difficult for us to be able to then put in place the kind of rigorous measures that we need to, not because we can't, but I think that I also find that we're sometimes very hesitant and sometimes a bit too beholden to what the neighbors will say and what international pressure might be brought to bear upon us. But we should also remember that there are other things we have going for us. We have platinum, we have commodities and so forth, which we could also use to leverage against the value of the rand, but we choose not to do that because we allow external forces to set those prices.
The decision of the court, Ms. Pheko, because we spoke to the Competition Commission last year and they mentioned that there's a whistleblower in this case. They've paid a fine. You've got other banks who've also paid a fine. They have admitted that indeed there was something that was amiss here. And so what now? Is that it?
It looks that way. I mean, I think what now we've seen that very few of our local banks are going to be prosecuted. One or two of the banks, most of the 5 banks that are going to be prosecuted, as you rightly say, those grievances and those complaints predate the one that came to light in 2023. In fact, they predate that by about a decade. So we're actually looking at an old matter. And I think I mentioned on a previous program that there was already this matter had arisen 20 years ago, and there was already a rand commission that was tabled at the time, and the 200-page report, and of course another report, a dissenting report that was prepared by Advocate Christine Kunta. And I think that these matters show that, firstly, that it takes a very long time for these matters to be tried. The costs of this, the attrition, the legal costs, the processes of also going to international bodies. Secondly, it also illustrates that we don't have enough a policy framework, a regulatory framework that protects us. And I think that this is the crux of it. It's well and good to blame or to point fingers, as I have, at Switzerland, at Japan, look at China. But the point is they are looking after their own interests, nefariously as it may be. And we need to be able to do that without being nervous of what the markets are going to say about us and so forth. And thirdly, we also need to bear in mind that unless and until we are able to have a legal system that is responsive to the reality rather than creating these sorts of anomalous, perverse results and outcomes, we're going to continue to go through this. So we went through this now in 2023. We went through this before in 2013. We also went through this, as I mentioned, 20 years ago when there was a commission that was, former Reserve Governor Tito Mboweni was also part of that commission. So this goes back a long way. And yet we don't seem to have the appetite to begin to put in controls and sanctions in place. And I think we're also very sanction averse. We don't want to upset other, potential partner economies. And I don't think that should be our posture. Many other countries, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Eritrea, for example, have utilized sanctions when they felt that either their currency was going to be threatened or, financial sanctions, economic sanctions to ensure that their own economies were protected at particular times. And they've done this by leveraging off of their commodities, commodities that are precious to them, to ensure that there isn't external flooding which will drive down those costs and diminish the value of their own currencies. We seem very reluctant to do these things. And unless we are able to do those things and the powers that be, I think that in 5-10 years, maybe we'll be having a conversation like this again, regrettably.
And therein lies the tragedy. Who is the markets? Who are the markets? What are the markets? What is the markets?
We are. We are actually, and then you pose an excellent question. So when you say, people tend to speak about the markets as though they are a strange person in the sky, some mysterious person in the sky, and yet they're not. The markets are really the sum total of the financial, the economic, and the fiscal decisions and the activities that all of us are engaged in. So when we go to buy bread, we go to buy petrol, we are also contributing to the market. So I think this whole idea that market forces out there on Mars are the cause of this is really false. And I think this is exactly part of the problem. The problem is that, much of the analysis and even the policy making behaves as though there isn't any autonomy and any sovereignty. And yet the market is a thing that, especially for a country like ours, which is still quite state-centric, although not always clear on its mandate, but I think trying to be people-centered, sometimes clumsily, sometimes inconsistently, it shows that we can have a state-led economy. And I think some of the countries that I've pointed to, like Taiwan, like China, like Thailand, for example, which per se are not necessarily our only peers, but they do show that you can have a state that is vested in controlling and curating the economy in a way that has much more predictable outcomes than this market-led, random, trickle-down hope of something that's going to happen, and these market forces which were held siege to, and it does not need to be this way. And in fact, it shouldn't be, especially because ultimately the people who are most hampered are you and me, Mdu Dlamini and Joe Blogs and Tandi Stole and Mpo Mukwena and many other people across this country who have to deal with what the cost of a devalued rand feels like in the pocket.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your time this afternoon. Political economist and senior research fellow at the Trade Collective, Lebohang Pheko.